My dear students, welcome to the second session on the topic Delight in Disorder, the poem written by Robert Herrick. I am D.C. Patil presenting this session. Today, let us move on to think over the poem for different interpretations, ponder over the poem to interpret the poem in different ways. So let us know and remember what we discussed about the poet in the last session. We discussed about the poet in the last session, Robert Herrick as a Cavalier poet, and he wrote against romantic exuberance, and also we discussed the textual meaning of the poem, the surfacial meaning of the text. We read the text line by line and we discussed the meaning of each line of the poem. So that much is not enough. We shall go forward to think about the poem with the objectives of analyzing the images with symbolic expressions, and for different interpretations possible, we can go for the poem once again. See, you have to be able to analyze the images with symbolic expressions. What are the symbolic expressions that we find in the text of the poem? We have to list them out and analyze them. Then you will be able to understand the poem so deeply and so authoritatively. So, see, we can have three possible interpretations beyond the textual meaning. Just you read the text, you can understand only the literal meaning of the lines. But beyond that literal meaning, beyond the textual lines, we do have the possible interpretations like one interpretation, that is revolt against Elizabethan romantic exuberance. This is one possible interpretation. It is the literary interpretation. And the second one, protest against slavish obedience to the social conventions of the Puritans. It is religious interpretation. As I explained, how some people supported Charles the King and how some others supported Puritans. So this poet was known as a Cavalier poet. He supported the King Charles I. So in that way I discussed in the last session. And the third interpretation, freedom against the constraints of discipline. So this is the third possible interpretation. We have to interpret all these interpretations. We have to operate all these interpretations upon the poem Delight in Disorder against the backdrop of the English Civil War of 1640s, that is political theme. And also, when you read this poem, you can see some of the symbols are used in the poem, some of the symbolic images are used in the poem as the symbols of the protest against Puritanism. And if you find out such meanings, such symbolic elements, you will see the religious theme in the poem. And it also sounds about the revolt against the imprisoned state of mind with restraints of discipline. It is a psychological theme. Let us think that the poet is neither on the side of King Charles I, nor on the side of the Puritans. He is on the side of free status of being free from all the restrictions. As a common individual in the society may think that the restrictions, either the restrictions laid down by the ruling system, should not destroy the freedom of an individual, freedom of a common man. In that way also, this poem can be interpreted, and that is a psychological theme. Then, let's go for the first interpretation that we discussed earlier about the poet's revolt against the Puritans' conventions, Puritanic rule, and slavish obedience to the Puritanic rule. That is enough. But now, let me go for another point of view of the interpretation of the poem. Another point of view of the analysis of the poem, that is, the poem stands as a symbol of the revolt against the Elizabethan romantic exuberance. Elizabethan romantic exuberance. Let us go for the history of English literature. In the history of English literature, we see after Renaissance, the Elizabethan period starts. And that Renaissance has influenced Elizabethan period a lot. After that Elizabethan period, 17th century restoration period starts. There we see still that Elizabethan period had some influence upon the writers of the 17th century. And against that romantic exuberance of the Elizabethan period, the poet raises his voice. How he raises his voice? With the concentration upon this poem, Delight in Disorder, how can we analyze the poem with the point of view of the revolt against Elizabethan romantic exuberance? Let us first think about romantic way of thinking, romantic way of writing, romantic way of reading. So, it is beautification. Romanticism is basically beautification. Romanticism is basically colorization, means it never presents something as it is. It presents something more beautiful than it is in reality, and more colorful than it is in reality, and more imaginative romanticism is, whether it is 19th century, 18th century, 19th century romanticism or 16th century romanticism. It is more imaginative, and also it sublimates the common things. The sublimation of common things is another feature of romanticism. All these together will see that romanticism never presents as it is, never presents anything as it is in reality. And this is what here the poet Robert Herrick revolts against. This is what exuberance he finds unnecessary. And that is why throughout this poem he goes on presenting some of the images and also some of the opposite expressions, oxymorons, to criticize this romantic exuberance. For example, how he revolts the romantic exuberance in this poem from the beginning to the end of the poem. See the title, it is Delight in Disorder. So delight is a romantic word. Disorder is anti-romantic word. So he presents these two together. In this way, he revolts against the romantic exuberance. And another, he says, wantonness, license. License from for what? Freedom. License means freedom. Freedom from what? Freedom from romantic exuberance. Freedom to show oneself as he is or as it is in reality. Means, if you want to be romantic, you have to be far-fetched from reality. You have to be away from reality. But the poet hates it, opposes it. He wants to be as he is. He wants to be as he is. That's why he wants to be free from the attempt of beautification, the attempt of colorization, the attempt of imagination, the attempt of sublimation. All these he opposes. So as a symbol of such protest, he uses such opposite words together. And then you move on into the poem, you go with many of the opposite expressions. Disorderliness in dress. So it is reality. But in romantic exuberance, we will see dress should be good looking. See why we dress? It is not just to cover our body. It is to show ourselves as more than what we are. So we want to be well dressed because we want to be attractive, more attractive than I am actually. So this is another opposite expression. And there in the last but one line, he uses bewitching, the word he uses bewitching. But it is against romantic exuberance because romantic way of in romantic style of writing, the romantic writers prefer the word attracting to this bewitching. Bewitching is something something treacherous. Bewitching is something teaching. Bewitching is something misguiding according to the romantic way of thinking. But the poet uses bewitching. Means he has an intention to revolt, to protest, to oppose the romantic exuberance. That's why he uses bewitching instead of attractive. And another opposite expression, wild civility. Usually in a romantic expression, we see everything beautiful, everything soft, everything attractive, everything very shining, everything colorful. But here the poet uses wild civility as against mild civility of romanticism. And another opposite expression that we notice in the poem, careless dress, carelessly thrown lawn over the shoulder, carelessly worn cloth, or it may be shirt, carelessly worn shoes, carelessly tied up stomacher. See, all these are carelessly used things. But in romantic way of life, we want to be carefully dressed. We want to be carefully dressed because the romantic way of life itself is to look good, look better than what I am. But here the poet doesn't want to show himself to be more than what he is, himself to be better than what he is. He wants to show himself as he is, and to against and to protest that romantic exuberance, he uses careless dress as the symbolic element. So I think you could understand how you can interpret this poem, analyze this poem with the point of view of the protest or the revolt against Elizabethan romantic exuberance. I think for this revolt against the Elizabethan romantic exuberance, this much is enough. These are the evidences that we come across in the poem with which you can analyze your approach with this point of view, revolt against Elizabethan romantic exuberance. The next one, that protest against social conventions of Puritans. For example, Puritans are known for known for discipline. Puritans are known for restrictions. Puritans are known for slavish obedience. So these are these are the features of Puritan way of thinking, Puritan rule, Puritan structure of the mind. So against that, the poet thinks. That is why he favored the King Charles I. So he was known as Cavalier poet in support of the King Charles I. And Puritans were in support of the church because the Puritans' rule was headed by the religious leaders like Pope or Bishop, Archbishop, etc. Here we can see three important symbolic elements: freedom versus discipline. We see in this poem freedom versus discipline. Disorder, see, disorder versus order. Disorder versus order means strict rules and no freedom. So that is disorder versus order. Then wantonness means license versus religious restraints. License or wantonness against religious restraints. So these can be the important elements we can have as the symbols to analyze the poem with the point of view of the protest against the slavish obedience to the social conventions of the Puritans. Now, let us move on to the next step of understanding the poem. Next attempt of understanding the poem in another different way, that the poet wrote this poem against the backdrop of the English Civil War of 1640s. So you can see it is a political theme and a religious theme we discussed. And as an individual, whether he is in favor of the King Charles I or he was against the Puritans, it doesn't matter. As a common man, if you read this poem, you can see the psychological theme here. Anybody who likes freedom, he or she opposes that religious bossism, opposes that religious restraints, opposes that religious restrictions, that religious confinement. And in that way, if we read this poem, it leads us to interpret with the psychological theme. Now, let us move on to some symbolic images in the poem. Disorder in the dress is used in this poem as the symbol of licentiousness. Disorder in dress is used as the symbol of licentiousness. How can you understand that disorder in dress as a symbol of licentiousness? Just I would like to give you an example. If you are at home, especially in your own bedroom, you shall not be aware of your dress. You will never bother what kind of a dress you have worn. If somebody comes outside to visit you, to meet you, suddenly you will search for a shirt and wear it and come out. Means, as you wish, as you feel comfortable, you will remain inside the bedroom without taking any care about the dress that you wear. In that way, you can understand disorder in the dress is used here as a symbol of licentiousness. Then you go for the next thing, a lawn into a fine distraction, a lawn thrown upon a shoulder into a fine distraction. What is it? What is it the symbol of? It is the symbol of negation of a Puritan conventions. Negation of a Puritan conventions means, if somebody wears a lawn over a shoulder, it should be properly folded and it should be properly put upon without any distraction. And this is the rule, this is the restriction. But he violates that restriction, and keeping it disorderly, he feels it is fine. The distraction of that is itself very fine for him. Means it is the negation of Puritan conventions. And then you go forward in the poem, then you go into the next part of the poem. There you see cuff neglectful, he says. Means somebody wearing a shirt keeps his handcuffs unbuttoned, and he leaves his earring lace hanging so disorderly. ribands hanging so disorderly, and untidy cloth he wears without any iron, and it has so many wrinkles. What is the meaning of all this? It is against the restraints of religion, against convention, against that religious power or puritanic power, etc. So these are the things which you can find as the symbolic elements or symbolic images in this poem. Then you go line by line in the poem in search of some oxymorons. You will find many oxymorons. Oxymorons means opposite words put together. They are called oxymorons. Both the words give opposite meanings, but still they are brought together to give one combined meaning, which is not possible, but that is made possible in this poem, and that itself is the strange thing that we find that poet has some intention into his mind while he writes this poem in this way. See the series of oxymorons in the poem. Delight in disorder, it is the title of the poem itself, has oxymorons. Delight is something positive, disorder is something negative, but these two are put together to give us one meaning. And sweet disorder, sweet is positive, disorder is negative, and these two are brought together. A lawn on the shoulder thrown into a fine distraction. A fine distraction. Distraction is something not systematic. Distraction is something improper. Distraction is something not well structured. And that looks fine to the poet. How is it possible? Distraction to be fine. How is it possible? But it is made possible by the poet in this poem. So it is another oxymoron, fine distraction. Then a wild civility. Wildness is uncivilized, but civility is against that wildness, but both are brought together. And tempestuous petticoat. Petticoat is to stay inside with safety, with security, but tempest is outside security, insecurity. So here once again you see opposite meaning in these two words, but they are brought together. So these are the oxymorons we find in the poem, and these oxymorons themselves will have their own meaning, which add lot of meaning to the poem, that to be analyzed, that to be interpreted, that to be extracted. So that is how we have to read this poem with all these details. Then only we can completely understand the poem in different ways. My dear students, what all we learnt out of this poem is we came to know the poet, about something about him, something in brief, and we read the text of the poem, and we explained each and every line of the poem, and then we tried to go for different interpretations of the poem, and we identified the series of oxymorons, and also we can identify the lines for annotations. If you are supposed to annotate the lines in the examination, if you see any lines extracted from this poem, you can easily identify those lines because we have discussed all those lines with their meanings. we have explained those lines with the meaning. That's why those lines have become very familiar to you. So you can easily identify those lines. ಇಲ್ಲಿಯವರೆಗೂ ನಾನು ನಿಮಗೆ ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲೇನ್ ಮಾಡಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಒಂದು 2 ನಿಮಿಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾತ್ರ ನಾನು ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲೇನ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತೀನಿ. ಇಡೀ ಪೋಯಮ್ಮು ಡಿಲೈಟ್ ಇನ್ ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು 2 ವಿರುದ್ಧವಾದ ಅರ್ಥ ಕೊಡುವ ಶಬ್ದಗಳನ್ನು ಹೊಂದಿರುವ ಒಂದು ಟೈಟ್ಲ್ ಇದು. ವೈರುಧ್ಯಗಳನ್ನು ಸೇರಿಸಿ ಈ ಪೊಯೆಟ್ ಈ ಪೊಯಮ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಭಾಳಷ್ಟು ಫ್ರೇಸಸ್ಗಳನ್ನು ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಇಡೀ ಪೊಯಮ್ನ ಅರ್ಥನ ನಾನು 1 ನಿಮಿಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಈ ಪೊಯೆಟಿನ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ಗ್ರೌಂಡನ್ನು ನೋಡಲಾಗಿ, ಅಂದರೆ ಆ 17th ಸೆಂಚುರಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದಂಥ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಸಿನಾರಿಯೋ ಏನಿತ್ತು, ಅದು ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟನ್ಸು ಮತ್ತು ನಾನ್ ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟನ್ಸ್ಗಳ ಮಧ್ಯೆ ಒಂದು ರಿಫ್ಟ್ ಇತ್ತು, ಒಂದು ಕ್ಲ್ಯಾಶ್ ಇತ್ತು. ಆಗ ಈ ಪೊಯೆಟ್ನಂಥ ಕೆಲವರು ದ ಕಿಂಗ್ ಚಾರ್ಲ್ಸ್ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ನನ್ನು ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದರು. ಹಂಗಾಗಿ ಅವ್ರನ್ನ ಕ್ಯಾವೆಲಿಯರ್ ಪೊಯೆಟ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಕರೆದರು. ಸೊ ಆಗ ಆ ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟನ್ಸ್ಗಳ ಒಂದು ಡಾಮಿನೇಷನ್ನು ತುಂಬ ಜನಕ್ಕೆ ಬೇಸರ ತಂದಿತ್ತು. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಆ ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟನ್ಸ್ಗಳ ರೂಲು ಏನೋ ಅವರ ಒಂದು ಆಳ್ವಿಕೆ ಇತ್ತಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ಒಂದು ರಿಲೀಜಿಯಸ್ ಆದಂಥ ಆಳ್ವಿಕೆಯಾಗಿತ್ತು, ಒಂದು ಧಾರ್ಮಿಕವಾದಂಥ ಆಳ್ವಿಕೆಯಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಅವರ ಲೀಡರ್ಗಳು ರಿಲೀಜಿಯಸ್ ಹೆಡ್ಸ್ಗಳಾಗಿರ್ತಿದ್ರು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ತುಂಬಾ ರೆಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಷನ್ಸ್ಗಳಿಂದ ಕೂಡಿತ್ತು ಅವತ್ತಿನ ಅವರ ಅಡ್ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ರೇಷನ್. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಅದರ ವಿರುದ್ಧ ಈ ಪೊಯೆಟ್ ಮಾತಾಡಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಚಾರ್ಲಸ್ ಫಸ್ಟನ ಪರವಾಗಿ ನಿಲ್ಲಬೇಕಾಗಿದೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರೊಟೆಸ್ಟ್ನ ಅಗೇನೆಸ್ಟ್ ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟನ್ಸ್ ಈ ಪೊಯಮಿನ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಡಿಲೈಟ್ ಇನ್ ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಅವ್ಯವಸ್ಥೆಯ ಒಳಗೆ ಒಂದು ಸಂತೋಷ ನನಗೆ ಅಂತ ಓಪನ್ನಾಗಿ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಮತ್ತು ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರ್ನ ಸ್ವೀಟ್ ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರ್ ಅಂತಾನೆ. ಏನಿದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಅಂದರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ತನಕ ಈ ಆರ್ಡರ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಏನಿತ್ತಲ್ಲ, ತುಂಬ ರೆಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಷನ್ಗಳಿಂದ ಕೂಡಿದಂಥ ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟ್ಯಾನಿಕ್ ಆರ್ಡರ್, ಅದು ಎಲ್ಲ ಇಂಡಿವಿಜುವಲ್ಗಳ ಫ್ರೀಡಮನ್ನು ಡೆಸ್ಟ್ರಾಯ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಹಾಕಿತ್ತು. ಅದರ ವಿರುದ್ಧ ಇವನು ಧ್ವನಿ ಎತ್ತಬೇಕಾಗಿತ್ತು. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರನ್ನು ಇವನು ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಅಗೇನೆಸ್ಟ್ ದಟ್ ಆರ್ಡರ್, ಅಗೇನೆಸ್ಟ್ ದಟ್ ಲಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಫ್ರೀಡಮ್, ಈ ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರನ್ನು ಇವನು ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಈ ಇಡೀ ಪೊಯಮ್ಮಿನ ತುಂಬೆಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಏನೋ ಟವಲ್ನ ನನ್ನ ಭುಜದ ಮೇಲೆ ಹೆಂಗೆ ಬೇಕಂಗೆ ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದ್ರಲ್ಲೇ ನನಗೆ ಸಂತೋಷ ಐತಿ. ನನಗೆ ಸ್ಟಮಕ್ಕರ್ಗೆ ಕಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಂಥ ಲೇಸ್ನ ಹೆಂಗೆ ಬೇಕಂಗೆ ಕಟ್ಕೊಳೋದ್ರಲ್ಲೇ ನನಗೆ ಖುಷಿ ಐತಿ. ಮತ್ತು ನಾನು ಶರ್ಟ್ ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರೂ ಕೂಡ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಕಪ್ಪನ್ನು ಅನ್ಬಟನ್ಡಾಗಿ ಬಿಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದು, ಬಟನ್ ಹಾಕ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋದೆ ಹೆಂಗೆ ಬೇಕಂಗೆ ಅಲ್ಗಾಡೋ ಥರ ಬಿಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಶಾಬಿಯಾಗಿ ಕಾಣೋದೇ ನನಗೆ ಖುಷಿ. ನೀವೇನು ಕೇಳೋದು ಅದನ್ನ ಅಂತ ಇವನು ಸರ್ಕ್ಯಾಸ್ಟಿಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ತುಂಬ ಐರಾನಿಕಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ಬರಿತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೆ. ಮುಂದೆ ಹೋಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾನೆ, ನಾನು ಏನೋ ಶೂ ಕಟ್ಕೊಂಡಿರೋ ಲೇಸ್ನ ಹೆಂಗೆ ಬೇಕಂಗೆ ಉದ್ದ ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೆ ಅಂದರೂ ಕೂಡ ನನಗೆ ಅದೇ ವೈಲ್ಡ್ ಸಿವಿಲಿಟಿ ಅಪ್ಪ, ನನಗೆ ಅದೇ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಕಾಣ್ತದಪ್ಪ ಅಂತಾನೆ. ಇವೆಲ್ಲವೂ ನನಗೆ ಈ ಸುಂದರವಾದ ಕಲೆಗಿಂತನೂ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ಅಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತವೆ ಅಂತಾನೆ. ಇದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಅವನು ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಇಷ್ಟಪಡ್ತಾನೆ ಅಂತ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಆದರೆ ಇಂಥ ಡಿಸಾರ್ಡರ್ ಮುಖಾಂತರ ಆ ಟೂ ಮಚ್ ಆಫ್ ರಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿಕ್ಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಪ್ಯೂರಿಟನ್ಸ್ ಐತಲ್ಲ, ಅದನ್ನು ಅಪೋಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಅದೇ ಥರ ಈ ರೊಮ್ಯಾಂಟಿಕ್ ವೇ ಆಫ್ ಥಿಂಕಿಂಗು, ರೊಮ್ಯಾಂಟಿಕ್ ವೇ ಆಫ್ ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಷನ್ನು, ಅದನ್ನು ಅಪೋಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಯಾಕೆ ರೊಮ್ಯಾಂಟಿಕ್ ವೇ ಅಂತ ಅಂದರೆ ಏನಪ್ಪ ಅಂದರೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಫುಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಬ್ಯೂಟಿಫಿಕೇಷನ್ನು, ಫುಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಲರೈಜೇಷನ್ನು, ಫುಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನೇಷನ್ನು, ಫುಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಸಬ್ಲಿಮೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಾಮನ್ ಥಿಂಗ್, ಬರೀ ಇಂಥದ್ದೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಎಲ್ಲದನ್ನು ಬರೀ ಕಲರ್ಫುಲ್ಲಾಗಿ ತೋರಿಸ್ಕೊಂತ ಹೋಗೋದ್ರಾಗ ಏನು ಅರ್ಥ ಐತಿ? ರಿಯಾಲಿಟಿಯಿಂದ ದೂರ ಉಳಿಯೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಏನು ಅರ್ಥ ಐತಿ? ಅನ್ನೋದು ಕೂಡ ಇವನ ಮೀನಿಂಗ್. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ರೊಮ್ಯಾಂಟಿಕ್ ಎಕ್ಸೂಬರೆನ್ಸ್ ವಿರುದ್ಧನೂ ಈ ಪೋಯಮನ್ನು ಬರೀತಾನೆ. ಸೊ ವಿತ್ ದಿಸ್ ಮಚ್ ಐ ಹೋಪ್ ಯು ಕುಡ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ದ ಪೋಯಮ್ ವೆರಿ ವೆಲ್. ನೌ ಲೆಟ್ ಮೀ ಇನ್ 2-3 minutes tell you about how to annotate the lines. ನಿಮಗೆ ಈ ಪೋಯಮ್ಮಿನ ಯಾವುದಾದ್ರೂ ಒಂದು ಲೈನನ್ನು ಅಥವಾ 2 ಲೈನನ್ನು ಎಕ್ಸಾಮ್ನಲ್ಲಿ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. ನೀವು ಆ ಸಾಲುಗಳನ್ನು ಅನೋಟೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಹೆಂಗೆ ಅನೋಟೇಟ್ ಮಾಡೋದು? ಆ ಪೋಯಮನ್ನು ಟೈಟ್ಲ್ ನೆನ್ಪಿಡಬೇಕು. ಸೊ ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್ ದ ಟೈಟ್ಲ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಪೋಯಮ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ರಿಮೆಂಬರ್ the poet's name. You should properly write the title of the poem without committing any spelling mistake, and you have to write the name of the poet, and then you have to explain the meaning of the lines, and if it is possible, try to locate the lines, whether these lines appear in the beginning or in the middle or by the end of the poem. You try to locate the lines, and also you should tell who speaks these lines, whose voice is there in these lines, and to whom these lines are spoken. You have to mention, and then you have to explain the meaning of the lines, and at the same time you should connect that meaning to the total theme of the poem, and that would be a very beautiful annotation. With this much, I would like to put an end to my presentation. I am very thankful to you for listening to me. Thank you one and all. ಎಷ್ಟು ನಿಮಿಷ ಆಯ್ತು?